Jimmy Kimmel's return to late-night television was meant to be his big reset. The cameras rolled, the band played, and the applause thundered as he walked on stage after his controversial suspension. He forced a wide smile, waving as though the last week hadn't happened, as though nothing had rattled his grip on the chair he had occupied for years. But the room knew better. The air buzzed with expectation, the audience clapping hard but waiting for him to prove he was still in control. The monologue came and went, polished but flat, his jokes stumbling out with the weight of someone trying too hard. The audience laughed, politely, cautiously. Then came the moment of truth, the night's first guest. And that's when the evening turned. "Please welcome Glen Powell," Jimmy announced. The band swelled, the doors opened, and Powell walked in with a confidence that instantly shifted the atmosphere. He strode across the stage in a tailored suit, flashing a grin that was equal parts charm and challenge. The crowd erupted, not with cautious politeness, but with genuine enthusiasm. Glen Powell wasn't just a guest. He was Hollywood's current golden boy, the man audiences wanted to see. Jimmy leaned in for a handshake, but Powell pulled him into a quick bro hug instead, whispering something that made Jimmy chuckle nervously before they both sat down. From the start, it was clear the energy didn't belong to Jimmy anymore. The irony of Powell's appearance wasn't lost on anyone. Jimmy had just returned from suspension, trying to steady his brand, and the first person across from him was an actor at the height of his momentum. Powell had just starred in a box office smash, his face plastered across billboards, his interviews trending on social media. He was riding the high of universal approval while Jimmy was still trying to explain why he had disappeared from screens for a week. Jimmy opened with a light remark. "Glen Powell, ladies and gentlemen, the man of the hour. Thanks for being here on what's been kind of a crazy week for us." Powell smirked, crossing one leg over the other. "Crazy for you, maybe. For me, it's been great." The crowd burst into laughter. Jimmy chuckled, but it was tight, forced. His eyes darted to the audience, then back to Powell. Already, the tone had shifted. Powell wasn't here to ease Jimmy back into late night. He was here to remind everyone just how shaky Kimmel's footing was. Jimmy tried to steer it back. "Well, I appreciate you being here. Big weekend for you. Congratulations on the movie." Powell leaned back, still smiling. "Yeah, thanks. Though honestly, Jimmy, the most entertaining drama wasn't in theaters. It was on this network." The audience erupted again, clapping and cheering, while Jimmy's smile froze for a moment before he forced out another laugh. The timing was brutal. Instead of being Jimmy's comeback night, it was a perfect storm where Powell's rise and Jimmy's vulnerability collided in front of millions. The unspoken rule of late night is simple. The host runs the show and the guest plays along. But Glen Powell ignored the rulebook. From the moment he sat down, he seized control of the conversation. Jimmy attempted to ask the first question. "So Glen, you've had an incredible run lately. Top Gun, rom-coms, blockbusters. You've basically been everywhere. What's that like?" Powell smirked. "Well, it's exhausting. Almost as exhausting as your week off." The room howled with laughter. Jimmy tilted his head, trying to laugh with them, but the tension was visible in his eyes. He tried to pivot. Yeah. It's been, interesting. But back to you." Powell cut him off. "No, seriously, how are you doing? I mean, you disappear for a week, everyone's talking about you, and then I'm the first guest back." "You couldn't have scheduled me better if you tried." The crowd cheered again, louder than before. Jimmy's comeback night had become a roast, and he wasn't the one delivering it. Every time Jimmy tried to regain control, Powell undercut him. When Jimmy asked about Powell's training regimen for his latest role, Powell leaned in with a sly grin. "Honestly, it was tough, but still easier than sitting in your chair right now." The laughter was explosive. Jimmy adjusted his tie, his face betraying the strain as he forced another laugh. "Wow, you've really come prepared tonight," Powell shrugged. "Hey, I just figured if you can dish it out all these years, you can take it too, right?" It was devastating. Jimmy, who had made a career out of mocking guests and skewering celebrities, was now being skewered on his own show, in his own chair. And Powell wasn't smiling apologetically after each jab. He was leaning into it, relishing it. Late-night audiences can make or break a moment. They laughed at Jimmy's monologue earlier, politely. But with Powell, they weren't polite. They were electric. Every quip, every jab, every sly remark landed with thunderous applause. The more Powell pressed, the more the crowd sided with him, At one point, Jimmy attempted to pivot back to Powell's new film. "So Glenn, tell us about your character. What drew you to this role?" Powell didn't miss a beat. "Well, Jimmy, I liked playing a guy who's confident, in control, knows what he's doing. It felt like something you could really learn from right now." The audience exploded, clapping and stomping their feet. Jimmy chuckled awkwardly, holding up his cards like a shield. "Wow, you're really laying into me." Powell leaned forward, flashing that movie star grin. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. I mean, look at them." He gestured toward the crowd, who immediately erupted in cheers again. Jimmy's laugh faltered. His body shifted in his chair, his shoulders tense. The unthinkable was happening. The audience wasn't laughing with the host. They were laughing at him. Their loyalty had shifted in real time. This wasn't Jimmy Kimmel Live anymore. It was the Glen Powell Show, and Jimmy was the punchline. Clips of the exchange hit social media before the show even finished airing. The crowd's roaring laughter, Jimmy's nervous smiles, Powell's casual dominance. It all spread like wildfire. Hashtags exploded. Comments poured in. By morning, the narrative was set. Glen Powell had humiliated Jimmy Kimmel on his own stage, on the very night he needed to look strongest. From the moment Glen Powell settled into his seat, the balance of the show was off. Jimmy Kimmel, usually the smooth commander of late-night chaos, showed cracks. At first it was subtle, a chuckle too loud, a pause too long, a glance at his cue cards that lingered just a second more than usual. But as Powell kept swinging, the cracks widened into full-blown fractures. Jimmy's face betrayed him. His trademark smile looked forced, stretched too wide, and every time the audience roared for Powell, his jaw tightened just enough to reveal the strain. He tugged at his jacket, shifted in his chair, shuffled his note cards with nervous fingers. Even his laugh betrayed him. Normally sharp and natural, it now rang hollow, like a man trying to convince the room he wasn't bothered, while clearly he was. Powell saw it, and so did the audience. At one point, when Jimmy stumbled over his words, Powell leaned in, smirking, and said, "Careful, Jimmy, you're supposed to be the professional here. Don't let me make you nervous." The crowd erupted, clapping and whistling. Jimmy forced out another laugh, but this time his eyes darted to the camera and back, as if pleading for a cut to commercial. There was no saving it. It was live, and his rattled energy was plain for millions to see. Even his interviewing rhythm collapsed. Normally, Kimmel built smooth setups and segues, but with Powell, his questions came out scattered, broken by awkward pauses. He asked about Powell's fitness training, but Powell cut him off before he could finish. He tried to move on to red carpet stories, but Powell steered the conversation right back to Jimmy's suspension with a sly smirk. The host, who usually thrived on keeping guests off balance, was now visibly rattled, fidgeting in his own chair, fumbling through his own show. No matter how much Jimmy wanted to move on, his suspension loomed over the night like a storm cloud. It wasn't just the elephant in the room. It was the stage, the lights, the cameras, everything. And Glen Powell refused to let it fade into the background. From his very first quip, Powell tapped into it. He never mentioned specifics, but every sly remark carried the same message. Jimmy's absence had left a mark. And the audience responded every single time. Jimmy tried to dodge. When Powell teased him about his week off, Jimmy laughed weakly and waved it away. Yeah, that's old news." But Powell leaned in, grinning. "Old news? Jimmy, you were gone longer than some of my press tours." The room howled. Jimmy's laugh faltered again, his eyes betraying the irritation he was trying desperately to mask. Every attempt to steer the conversation back to Powell's projects failed. The suspension shadowed it all. When Jimmy asked about Powell's preparation for his role in Anyone But You, Powell smirked. "Honestly, preparing for that was nothing compared to how much work it must have been for your producers to get you back here." Another eruption of laughter. Jimmy's shoulders sank. He had lost control of the narrative, and Powell knew it. The cruel truth was that Jimmy's suspension had damaged his image, and Powell's refusal to politely ignore it only magnified the wound. Instead of fading into memory, it became the night's running theme. Not through Jimmy's words, but through Powell's relentless reminders, and the audience wasn't laughing out of sympathy. They were laughing at Jimmy's expense, reveling in the awkwardness, enjoying every jab Powell delivered. What was supposed to be a clean slate became a public trial. With Jimmy unable to defend himself, the most humiliating part of the night wasn't a single line or moment. It was the realization that the roles had reversed. On Jimmy Kimmel Live, the host is supposed to dominate. The guest follows the host's lead, laughs at his jokes, and supports his control of the room. But Glen Powell flipped the entire structure upside down. By the halfway mark of the interview, Powell wasn't acting like a guest. He was acting like the host. He asked Jimmy questions, teased him, pushed him, and the audience responded to him as though he were the main attraction. Jimmy tried to set up a story. "So, Glenn, I heard you had an interesting moment on set recently." Powell cut in before he could finish. "Oh, I've had interesting moments, sure, but none as interesting as what you've been through. Tell us, Jimmy, how's it feel being the guest on your own show?" The crowd exploded. Laughter, claps, whistles. Jimmy froze for a split second before forcing a laugh, muttering, "That's not how it works." But it was how it worked that night. Powell leaned back in his chair, comfortable, commanding, while Jimmy sat forward, tense, defensive. The host looked like the guest, scrambling to explain himself while the guest held court. The audience rewarded Powell at every turn. When Jimmy tried to regain control, his lines landed flat. When Powell responded, the room lit up. It was undeniable. The power dynamic had shifted completely. By the end of the segment, Jimmy wasn't leading the conversation. He was reacting to Powell's jabs, reacting to the audience's laughter, reacting to his own loss of authority. He had gone from master of the stage to punchline of the night, and there was no way back. The segment hadn't even finished airing before the internet went to work. Audience members with phones in hand had already clipped Powell's sharpest lines and Jimmy's most awkward reactions. By the time the closing credits rolled, TikTok was flooded with edits, Twitter was ablaze with GIFs, and YouTube reaction channels had begun dissecting the humiliation frame by frame. One clip in particular, Powell grinning as he asked, "How's it feel being the guest on your own show?" spread like wildfire. Within hours, the hashtag #SattarPowellOwnsKimmel trended worldwide. Fans looped Jimmy's nervous chuckle against laugh tracks, zoomed in on his shifting body language, and paired it with captions like, "When the roast master gets roasted." Another clip showed Powell brushing off Jimmy's question about his film with a smirk. Yeah, but enough about me. Let's talk about your week off." That line was replayed endlessly, often side by side with news screenshots about Jimmy's suspension. What Jimmy had hoped audiences would forget was now immortalized in memes. By morning, the numbers were brutal. Millions of views across platforms, Powell's name trending above Jimmy's, and headlines framing the entire night not as Jimmy's return, but as Powell's conquest. The clips didn't just spread, they stuck. They crystallized the power shift in public memory. Glen Powell as the witty, confident conqueror, Jimmy Kimmel as the rattled, humiliated host. The media wasn't kind the next day. Entertainment writers, columnists, and TV critics piled on, framing the interview not as a lighthearted return, but as a debacle. "Jimmy Kimmel's comeback turns into Glen Powell's playground," wrote one outlet. Another was harsher. "The host who built his career on roasting others was roasted into silence. Even longtime supporters admitted the damage." "Jimmy looked rattled," one columnist said. "He lost control of his own stage." For a late-night host, that's fatal. Industry blogs dissected the fallout with brutal honesty. Advertisers, they noted, had already been nervous about Jimmy's suspension. Now, with clips of him being dismantled by a guest going viral, questions about his authority and longevity resurfaced. "This wasn't just a bad night," one analysis read. "It was a career-damaging moment that undermined his entire brand." The comparison was inevitable. Kimmel had once built a reputation as the fearless host, the man unafraid to cut celebrities down with wit. But when the tables turned, when the guest came prepared to do the same, Jimmy faltered. Critics highlighted the hypocrisy. If you make your living embarrassing others, you'd better be prepared to take it. Last night, Jimmy couldn't. It wasn't framed as an awkward interview. It was framed as humiliation. And in late-night television, perception is everything. For Glen Powell, the night was transformative. He had arrived on the show as Hollywood's rising star, already popular for his blockbuster roles. But by the end of the segment, he wasn't just an actor promoting a film. He was the man who dethroned Jimmy Kimmel on live TV. Fans celebrated his sharpness. Social media crowned him the new face of charisma. Journalists who had gone to cover his movie now found themselves writing about his dominance on the talk show stage. Powell leaned into it. In interviews days later, he smiled coyly when asked about the moment. "Hey, I was just having fun," he said, knowing full well the internet had cast him as the victor of the exchange. That humility only amplified his image. Confident enough to take down a late-night titan, grounded enough to shrug it off. Casting directors noticed. PR agents noticed. Powell's stock rose overnight. What had started as another press tour stop had turned into a cultural event, cementing him not just as an actor, but as a media force. He didn't just sell a movie. He sold himself as the man who could walk into any room, even Jimmy Kimmel's, and own it completely. It was the kind of star-making moment you couldn't buy. And Powell had pulled it off live, unscripted, in front of millions. For Jimmy, the consequences were devastating. This wasn't just a rough night. It was a stain on his career, a public dismantling that he couldn't laugh away. Late-night hosts rely on authority. They must appear unshakable, in control, always one step ahead. But that night, Jimmy lost all of it. He looked weak, rattled, and overshadowed. Powell didn't just outshine him, he exposed him. And that exposure lingered. Fans who once saw Kimmel as the clever roast master now replayed clips of him fidgeting, forcing awkward chuckles and squirming under Powell's comebacks. His suspension, already a sore spot, became forever tied to this humiliation. Instead of a triumphant return, his comeback became a punchline in Powell's hands. Industry insiders whispered about decline. "Once the audience stops laughing with you and starts laughing at you, you're done," one critic said bluntly. And for Jimmy, that was exactly what happened. The viral clips weren't just funny, they were damaging. They shifted perception. They made him look old, out of touch, and unable to defend his own ground. It was in many ways a dethroning. The man who had roasted so many celebrities was finally roasted himself, and he lost. Not in a playful back-and-forth sparring match, but in a one-sided humiliation that left his guests celebrated and his own image diminished. Jimmy Kimmel's legacy had been built on control. That night he lost it, and Glen Powell walked away with the crown. The fallout echoed far beyond the studio. Powell's clips kept circulating, his reputation soared, and Jimmy's suspension, instead of fading into memory, became tied to the most humiliating night of his career. What should have been a redemption arc collapsed into a cautionary tale. Even kings of late night can be dethroned, and sometimes all it takes is one guest who refuses to play nice.